We were doing some, friend of mine and I were doing some work around loading data into Elasticsearch and then trying to figure out how to enrich data in Elasticsearch so we could add more data to an index. And then we were doing pipelines and we were doing, anyway. And so it came down to, it turned out there were a couple operations for the different data sets we were playing with. We do all the time, and we can write custom code, Python code for that. That's great. And in the case, I didn't want to do that. So I created a framework that'll load that data into Elasticsearch. And why would I do that? What's the point of all of this? And it turns out it's because we actually, for each one of the indexes in Elasticsearch that we're going to load data, and in my case, I have two examples here. I have Medicare providers, and I've got DOT transports. And so I'm going to use one of these as an example of this talk. And that one is these Medicare providers. It turns out I want to load a bunch of CSV files from data that comes for all the millions of providers for Medicare, and then I want to create an index for those and load those up and maybe create some mappings, and I did some phonetics and some other things around them. So I wanted to not just load the data, I wanted to tune how that data was loaded, and I don't want to write code for this every time I want to load another data set, so that's what we did here with this. And basically how this works is you can have an arbitrary number of steps in a, you know what, let me reload that. You can have an arbitrary number of steps in a configuration. So basically you have a project, which is two directories, a config and data and a configuration.json. And the config.json will tell you what steps need to be run in the order they're running, which are basically subdirectories. And then it tells you what phases for each of those steps you want to implement. And why is that? It turns out because there's a couple different things we do. We create indexes and aliases. We create enrichment policies. We create pipelines. We bind those pipelines to the enrichment policies, and then we can either populate an index directly by just loading it directly using the bulk loader, parallel bulk loader, or we can actually cause that index to be populated by the pipeline, which will pull in the enrichment policies, which means I now can create an augmented index, right? And it turns out those are the four things I did in both my data sets. So I created what I called phase processors for those. And for any step, you can decide which phase process you want to work. And for this Medicare one, I'm going to show you, basically, we only have CMS providers, Medicare providers. We have a single configuration directory, a single data directory, and all we have is these three config files, which makes me think we have a couple phases here. And if I were to open the config file for this, we can see that this processor is one step, doctors and clinicians, because it turns out I only had one index to build. And we're going to create the index. We're going to create a map for the index. And the mappings, we're going to load the mappings, and we're going to do the populate. And that's it. And so we're just going to use those config files and call those. This just tells you what all of them are. And then it turned out we have a configuration dir, which is called configuration, right? So this is the config file that drives this, tells us where the data dir is, and it tells us what the default log level. And then there are other things in each of these configs, like if I wanted to load the config, I can tell it what the index is and what the alias is for that. So we actually create a new index, compiling some of the best practices, which is dated for the index we loaded, and we create an alias to it so all the queries can still run. This lets us do in-place update. So this thing, I guess I should say that, it supports in-place updates indexes, right? And did I say that in here? Man, you know what? I'm going to have to add that. Close work items, in-place updates. Yeah, I'll have to add that. Anyway, so the net result, right, is that we have this configuration structure here, and we run phases, and that lets us load data into Elasticsearch, and I'm going to show you that. And these are what the phases do. I just talked about that. And the data is basically organized by step. So in the case of this one, where I've only got a single step, right? Config doctor clinicians. I didn't load any of the hospitals or any of the other data. I just did doctors and clinicians. Then I only have one step in the config, one step, and then one CSV file, and this thing will load that. So that's that. What else? I guess that's it. So one thing I wanted to show you real quick is I'm actually running an Elasticsearch cluster in Docker because I think that's cool. There's a link on the README that shows you what cluster. This thing, the cluster Docker config I did automatically pulls in the Elasticsearch, a bunch of the plugins. So the extra plugins that aren't there in their image by default, so that we could do things like phonetics and white space elimination and all of that kind of stuff. Oh, did I put that in here somewhere? I guess I did, right? So yeah, I have these analyzers configured in here. Like we're going to wipe out, we're going to clean up the names, and we're going to do phonetic, and you can do all kinds of other stuff. So this thing supports all of that. You just tell it what configs you want to load, and as it runs through the step processor, it will basically run these phase processors, and you can extend this by adding new phase processors. If it turned out that the 4 phases that I had here were not enough to do what you want to do, because it might not. We had a case where we wanted to run an extract job, merge some data together, and then reload a new index. You could do that. And so let me just show you real quick. I'm going to run this thing. And so in this case, let me close that. Oh, we're so close. I'm going to execute, call it execute template, and we're going to, oh, that would have failed. So let's do, that's, that would have been the demo got a heck. So we're going to do -- project CMS providers, right? And we can see that that's a directory called CMS providers here. So it's basically just going to load this configuration.json that I showed you before, and then it's going to execute that and load this. And, oh, what was the other thing I wanted to show you? Oh, yeah. So if we go to the index page here and we hit reload the index, this is the Kibana on the local Docker cluster. We can see there's no index that's interesting there. If we were to run this, oh, that was so bad. It's not called execute template. It's called, no, it's called execute project. Yeah, it was the demo got a hack. There we go. So you can see here that it's actually going to run. You don't know what it's doing, but that's cool. Let me make this wider so it doesn't look so bad, right? And it actually loaded 50,000 records. And this thing's actually got millions of records, so we could actually tell it to load all the records, but I didn't want to. So that loaded 50,000 providers. Let me just run it again, and you'll see that we actually get warning in another color this time, and what that means is that index already exists, so it's not going to create it over again. And so there'll be some places where you'll get warnings or errors in here, so this code isn't complete. And that makes sense, right? What we did, though, is we re-indexed it. We reloaded all the data, but we didn't actually have to create the index again. So now if we hit reload here, we actually see that we have a doctors and clinicians. And if you look at it, you can see that doctors and clinicians has the daily load file here, right? It's got today's date for the daily load, and we loaded 25,000, even though I said 50,000. And why is that? Because I probably used the wrong dang index for this, and some of those records ended up being dupes, right? And then if we want to see how this would really work, we can actually go over and we can say discover, and we can create a new data view in Kibana, right? And no, not create a field. What am I thinking? I'm going to actually do this. Create a new data view. You can see now that we actually, what I did was we created an index so all the searches can be bound, I'm sorry, an alias, so they can all be bound to the alias. And we can see that the actual one here, and so this alias points at this index. So in my case, I actually want to create a data view that is bound to the alias, and that way this data view will continue to work. We'll just keep, every time we reload the data and we change the name of the index, if we decided we needed to do that on some massive update, then that would work. And so now we can see that we actually have the data and clinicians, and we can see all the data that came in from that data set. And that's it, man. So basically the idea here is we have a framework that lets you load entities into Elasticsearch, and it will do things like create the index mappings, do the aliases, run enrichment policies, let you bind to pipelines. I didn't do that in this one. And it'll let you populate any of the indexes either directly or via the pipeline, and it will import data from comma delimited files. Oh, and because there are parameters here, you can pick which steps you want. So if you had multiple steps, like if I had 5 different steps, 5 different data sets, and I just want to keep reloading the last one because I'm trying something, you can tell it which step you want to do. And that's it, and it's out on this GitHub, and all the diagrams were done with Node.js, and I'm out of time, so I hope that's useful. I will do a multi-table example in another video. Bye.